I now move in slide number 14 to considering how scientists and researchers try to measure the phenomenon of vertical skill mismatch. In other words, instances where we will try to understand how many qualification mismatches and mismatches between the skills of workers and the skills required by jobs exist. So this is now trying to measure mismatch of people who are already in jobs. And there are three very popular methods that are typically used. The one method is called the empirical method. And this is a method whereby researchers will try to understand what is the most typical level of qualification that you would need in order to be able to do a particular occupation. So, researchers take data, usually the labor force survey, they look at the educational level of individuals who are employed in a particular occupation, and then they try to understand what is the most frequent, or what is the average education that people who are working in that occupation possess. You may find, for example, that the level of education that you need in a given occupation is an upper secondary qualification. If you then compare this qualification level that is required to do the job with the level of the education that individuals themselves have, you then understand if there is a qualification mismatch or not. So if the individual has a university qualification, but he is employed in a job requiring an upper secondary qualification, then you would be able to establish that this individual is an overqualified individual. But there are many problems with this technique. And typically the biggest problem is that the typical level of education and qualification that you need in a different occupation is not fixed. It's not stable. Over time, as more and more people attain a higher level of education, this then affects in the data what appears as being the most typical level of education needed. So this creates problems in terms of measuring qualification mismatch consistently over time. Another method that has been proposed is to try to use the job evaluation method. In other words, to ask professional job analysts what is the most usual educational level needed to be able to do a job. And this technique is typically believed to be a more accurate way of understanding what is the required educational level, because you are relying on professionals and experts who are working in a particular sector or in a particular occupation. So you believe that they have an insider knowledge. Nevertheless, there is some sort of subjectivity involved, and it is also the case that to be able to rely on this method, it is a very expensive method. And it is also a method that is very difficult to be able to repeat many times over the years. So it may be an exercise that you would do, and then you would need a long time period until you repeat the exercise. So in that interim period, you cannot really measure qualification mismatch over the years. The final method that is used is the so-called subjective method. And this is based on asking the workers themselves to self-assess what do they think is the level of education that is needed to be able to do their job or to get hired in their job. So some people would argue that this is a good way to understand what is the level of education needed, because it is the workers themselves who are doing the job. It is the workers themselves who every single day they are carrying out their tasks. So you would expect to observe that these workers have also an insider knowledge. But at the same time, we are wary of the fact that asking individuals themselves to assess the level of education needed can sometimes be subject to also biases because of subjectivity. So overall, these three methods tend to be used. The subjective method and the empirical method is used more frequently, but it is very important to be careful that you can get different results depending on the method used, and sometimes we can observe big inconsistencies between these methods. In slide number 15, I show to you the results that one would obtain if they applied the empirical method to the European Labour Force Survey data, in order to be able to capture what is the percentage of overqualified workers in the different European member states. By doing this exercise, you can see that countries in south of Europe, such as Portugal, Spain, Greece, Italy, have a very high percentage of overqualified workers, close to 20% or even exceeding 20%. Whereas some countries such as Finland, the Czech Republic, Bulgaria, Denmark are affected less by this problem. Typically, we observe that around 1 in 3 tertiary education graduates are overqualified or overeducated in European labor markets. So it is an important problem, but it is also a problem which affects particular countries more so than others.